I don't know, my father was a bus driver, but I don't remember back that far.
Sure.
He took me to a ball game when he took the team up, and it was snowing on the way home, and somebody was leaning out the door to make sure he wouldn't drive off the road.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Oh my goodness. All right. So everybody's having a good day, just a little damp?
Yes.
But we prayed for that.
Yeah, we sure did. I apologize. I had to reboot my computer. It was sometimes when it goes to sleep and comes back on, when you close the lid and open it back up, it doesn't like to see the cameras, either one of them. It just won't. So we can't stream to the internet then, so people can hear the Bible study. I'm pretty sure Amanda Bombico at least joins us from online. So, okay. So where have we left off? Where do you have us?
25:13.
25:13, that's where I have too. Great. I was right there. So, prayer requests before we begin. I'll give the update to you all that I gave to Barb. Christine Diefendorfer, who we prayed for in service on Sunday, she took a fall and broke her hip in 3 places. But she is doing well. The doctors are very pleased. And she's strong, and they are moving her to rehab at Moravian Hall Square this morning. Her grandson called me. He says, I'm about 20 minutes from there. I'll text you her room number when I get there. So he's very excited. And she was in good spirits when I visited her on Saturday. But we'll pray for her healing as we go. Any other prayers?
Jamie Hahn needs help inside of herself. Jamie, I mean, she's a wonderful person, but
she sure is.
She's so down on herself.
Yeah. She. We all love her. We all try to show her that she's doing well. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let us pray. Lord, we thank you for the chance to be in the warm and the dry on a cold and wet day, for the chance to be in your word again and receive the blessings that only it can bring. Lord, we gather, we pray for our sister Christine, and that she might completely heal from her recent fall. And also for Gloria Mazzi, who ended up in a collision at work as well, and is taken a fall as well, has a broken wrist as a result. We also pray for our sister Jamie, and for all those who need a little uplifting of their spirits. Remind us, Lord, that we don't need to be enough, for you are enough. And as we struggle to do our best in this life, give us the resources we need and the time and attention to employ them. We ask for this and whatever else is needed. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay. All right, so we are at Acts 25:13, and so we're going to see some interesting stuff as the book of Acts rushes to a conclusion. All right. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa, the king, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and to be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. Okay, so.
He doesn't know what he's in for.
So what do we see going on here?
Politics.
Well, undoubtedly, yes. So who passes him along to Felix? We have this sort of passing along, right?
Right.
Agrippa?
Well, yep. You have Ananias, right, who comes with the case against him, and so we go from the guy in charge of the tribunal, passes him along to who's our first. I wish I had a better record for names in my head. Passes him along to Felix, and Felix passes him along to the new guy, Festus. Yep. And now Festus is passing him along to Agrippa. This is called pass the buck.
Right.
No one wants this is politics. You're absolutely right. Nobody wants to have any sense that they're responsible and therefore can be criticized for the decision they have made, right?
Same as today?
And what do
Exactly the same as today. Nothing new.
What do they mean by a condemnation? I mean, that would include
Death.
prison time? Oh,
No,
that would be death.
That would be death.
Okay.
Yeah, they were hoping for death. Yeah.
But
It could include prison time, but I think that's what they were agitating for, was basically saying he's causing such upheaval. The only way you're going to have peace in this nasty little province you hate is if you kill
Get
him.
rid of him.
Yeah.
Now, my translation uses the word superstition in verse 19.
Verse 19. So
About
it-
their own superstition about the one Jesus.
Okay.
who was dead.
Right. So there you go, and that's an interesting. Yours is probably the RSV. This is an ESV. One of you probably has the NIV. What do you have there, Dave? In verse 19.
I'm sorry, I was.
Here it says that it's the same word used by Paul. Religion, superstition for religion.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I'm guessing that what we have here is that you're sort of seeing the Roman. It is the same word, but what you probably are seeing is two people in two different communities, meaning the Romans over here and the Jews over here, using the same word in different ways. The same way that Lutheran wasn't a pejorative, but Methodist was. Methodist was a slur leveled against a certain group of Anglicans led by John Wesley and crowd. I mean, it was the sophisticated theologians saying, "Oh, those idiots." So they took that word to themselves, and it became a point of pride, right? So the same way that in the homosexual community, gay was appropriated by them. It was originally a slur, and then it became something they like we're gonna call ourselves that in defiance. I think what you're probably seeing is that use of the word. That what you have, the word that is translated as superstition in yours, and is translated as just dispute in mine. Probably from the Roman perspective, the Jews are all arguing about nonsense, right? So, but they think it's really substantive. So I'm not saying that the Jews took the word and appropriated it the way the Methodists appropriated the word Methodist, but I'm guessing that the Romans picked up the Jewish language for a religious dispute. You don't dispute about religious things in Roman culture. It's silly. You just add one more god to the pantheon, and you do your thing, and I'll do my thing. There's no dispute because there's no absolute truth, right? This is what is at the heart of, I think, what we're calling woke politics now, but really is the blossoming of Marxist theory in the social realm. The fight is against the logos. I mean, this is ultimately coming after Jesus, because as the logos, the word, right, Gospel of John, Jesus represents the face of God to us, right? Because if you've seen him, you've seen the Father. So that puts an end to disputes, is his claim. I am the way, the truth, the life, not a way, a truth, a life. And so with the death of the logos comes the death of all the ologies, right? I mean, people thought this would stick in the social, this was a social theory. Now you're seeing scientists who are saying, oh, there's 5 sexes. Well, there's absolutely no evidence at all of that. There's 2 sexes. And then there's asexual if you're an amoeba. or something similar to that. Okay, there's 3 categories that we have from biology. And the scientists who won't play the game are getting screamed at and pilloried and their funding taken away and this kind of stuff. Well, with the death of the logos comes the death of the ologies. There's no more science. There's no more objective truth to point to. I think that's part of what's going on here. Eventually this has to come, and it's why there's so much animosity towards Christianity in particular, in addition to just what Christians would call the demonic stuff in the background, right? Just on the face of it, Jesus represents a claim to truth, which they reject. Everything, the only truth you have in wokeism is your personal truth, meaning and it's not that's a way of saying what I express. It's just like an artist. It's not truth. It's just me expressing myself. But that's claimed to be the only kind of truth there is. He also represents history, which they want to reset history, right? I mean, because the Christian claim is that God took form in a historical moment and walked around for 30 odd years as a human being and this kind of stuff. He also represents authority, which is rejected. So I think that it has to come after them. But it's really no different than what the Romans were perplexed by when they looked at Jews. They watch these disputes, right, between all these rabbis. They're arguing why are they arguing? Arguing is what you do in court. It's what you do in politics. It's not what you do in religion. In religion, you eat with your God, you ask for favors, and you make sacrifices. They didn't get it at all. And this is why in the Enlightenment, when they were trying to sort of put Christianity into a box alongside other religions, because they were coming out of a Christian culture, so they were trying to get a position outside of Christianity to categorize it. They called us ethical monotheism, along with Judaism and Islam. Ethical monotheism. One God, and to that married the idea of ethics. Ethics are not the point of religion in most of the world, and certainly not in the Western world prior to Christianity and Judaism. Greek religion was not about ethics. Philosophy was about ethics. Religion was about participation in a ritual life with the god or goddess that you were working with, right? And Socrates was accused of being an atheist, not because he didn't believe in God, but because he only believed in one God. He was accused of corrupting the morals of the Athenian youth because he was teaching them there was only one God. It wasn't his philosophy that got him in trouble. It was what he believed about God. So this is the Romans looking over at the Christians and or the Jews would be like, I don't get it at all. What are they bothering with this for? So yeah, I think that may be why we see that word translated in those different ways, and why it would be the same word that Paul would use, right? What Paul would use, isn't that what your footnote is going at? Is that the word Paul used for religion is the word they're using for superstition, right? Yeah. There you go. Other points. Great catch.
They were concerned that they would have opportunity to defend themselves.
Yes. So the Roman court system is similar to ours, but not identical. Okay. What we call British common law, which is what our tradition is founded upon here in America. The idea of common law was that the law was common to all people, meaning the king didn't hand down the law, which was different than almost everywhere else in the ancient world, right? The king made the rules, but by definition that meant the king was above the rules. In the common law situation, even the king stands under the law that's common to all of us. As Deacon Michael would say, said recently following Queen Elizabeth's death, they're going to throw the same dirt on her they throw on me. Okay, that sensibility was very different than most of the ancient world, right? In almost every other ancient religion, the local king represented a deity on earth. And that this included the Roman Empire, where Caesar was the son of God. That was the title. That was what you saw in the Roman coins. That was Pharaoh. He was a god on earth. I forget. I think he was the son of Ra was what he was associated with. It included the Hindu local kings, were considered to be incarnations of not Vishnu. Was it Vishnu? Krishna, I think. They were considered to be an avatar of Krishna. They had a blessing from Krishna, and so they were to be regarded as a god speaking when they spoke. So the common law tradition builds on the Roman tradition, but the Roman tradition, the way it builds on it is it makes the law apply to everybody, including Caesar, right? Theoretically, that was there, but again, what's the distinction in the Roman tradition is that you have this ability to face your accuser. What you don't have, that the modern system added, is the presumption of innocence. There is no presumption of innocence in the Roman system. It's simply you have the right to face your accuser, but there's no presumption that you are innocent. So it's not on the accuser to prove your guilt, which is what it is in modern American politics, which is one of the reasons why some of the woke politics wants to overthrow the Constitution, because the presumption of innocence is what they want to get rid of. All that matters then would be the accusation. The accusation then becomes, you have to prove you're innocent of the accusation, which is what you saw during things like the Salem witch trials, right? Now, Salem witch trials are noteworthy because they're exceptional in American experience. They're rare. Those kind of witch trials were not rare through huge sections of Europe. But they were rare in England and they were rare in America, largely because of the British common law presumption of innocence piece.
But the proof of innocence in the witch trials was death anyway.
Well, that's just it. That's what I'm saying. The witch trials, there wasn't a presumption of innocence. That was what made them weird and unique. That's why everyone knows the Salem witch trials because there were only about 3 in all of American history. And that was the big one because more people were caught in that net than in other ones. It was atypical because of this presumption of innocence, and it was crushed really quickly. It was interesting if you look at the history of it. People like the president of Harvard, who was a pastor and theologian, and these people are weighing in, saying this is the wrong way to go about this. This is theologically not sound. And so it sprung up and then it ended really quickly. Whereas in huge sections of Europe, it sprung up and kept going for generations. And there were no theologians offering this perspective. So anyway,
Now Paul is he's asked, do you want to go to Jerusalem? And he says, no, I want to be heard before the emperor. Is his reasoning because I can get my message out before the emperor? If I go to Jerusalem, it'll be kind of hush-hush and get rid of him.
It's an interesting question. We're not told what Paul was thinking. I'm sure that was part of it. But even if he never makes it to the emperor, he's giving an excuse right up front for everyone to keep passing the buck. Mm-hmm. He wants to go to the emperor. Does that mean I can keep passing it along? It means one more person. I can keep going with this, right? Theoretically, every Roman citizen can make that appeal in their case. Most of the time, you're going to get cut off long before you get to the emperor. Because every one of these new authorities who steps in, who's one leg higher up the ladder of command, represents the emperor when they're there. Okay.
So they could stop.
So they could stop it. The question is, do they want that responsibility?
Yeah.
So I think Paul's at least playing it so it plays out his hand. Certainly, the longer he lives, the longer he can preach, right? And the more people he can spread the message to. And we will see his jailers coming to faith like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's did much later, and stuff like this. So I think he's playing the long game, as we would say. His eventual goal might be to get to the emperor. Will he make it? We don't know. But that might be his hope. At the very least, though, we're looking at delays of several years. Well, under Felix, he was sitting in prison for a good 2 years before Festus came in.
And the higher up he goes, the more power it gives him.
Yes. The higher every time he presents this story again, I learned this from actually the people who encouraged us in our homeschooling. One of them has been a street preacher on the campus of Penn State since about 1978. He's been at this a long time. I just saw him on Friday when I went up for a funeral. He's very sophisticated. He's a complete wallflower. You wouldn't notice him unless he's doing his job. He is not a fire and brimstone guy unless he's preaching. And then he'll get out there and he'll just mix it up with the philosophy students. He stands outside the philosophy building and they want to argue with him. I had met him at a picnic one time. And he said to me, well, the person I'm arguing with doesn't have an open mind. They're just there to try and convince me. They're not open to being convinced. He said.
Yeah.
So while I'm arguing with them, a crowd gathers. He says, I'm watching
So
the
it's
crowd.
really the crowd.
Yeah, that's what he says. I'm watching the crowd, and I watch for the person nodding their head because they're listening.
Mhm.
They haven't decided. They're not there just to cheer for one side or the other. They're there because they have an open mind. And when the crowd disperses, I go over to them and say, let's talk. You look like you have some questions. And that's what he's done for 40 odd years. So I'm imagining it's very much like that for Paul. Every one of these is every time he speaks the gospel, it's a public forum to do it. Right? So yeah, absolutely.
What would have been Agrippa's reason? He said he wanted to hear this man himself.
Interesting to know. Curious, maybe. What makes him? It's, for those of us who know and love Jesus Christ Superstar, right? That's King Herod. Herod wants in Jesus Christ Superstar, the way they play Herod's character is he wants. Show me some of these miracles. And of course, that's actually in the Gospels. It actually says he wanted to produce some sign, and Jesus refused. Right? Of course, they play it up. That's the whole point of Herod's song.
And he may also be curious because Paul was a Pharisee.
Right.
True.
And, and has some standing within his community.
Right.
And now he's talking about something that a lot of people think is very bizarre.
Yeah. Why would
Yeah.
Roman culture is obsessed with status, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would someone give up all their status? That's what you spend a lifetime trying to accumulate. The Roman value is glory. That's the idea of remember in the ancient world, and this was common to. When I say the ancient world, I'm not talking about the religions of Mesoamerica or the Far East. I'm talking about, like, say, from India westward, through Europe. Common to the ancient religions of the Middle East, of North Africa, of Europe. Their conception of life after death was as a kind of shadow world where you didn't have much substance, and you certainly couldn't get anything. You couldn't get anything done. You were barely alive. It wasn't a pleasant place to be. It was some sort of shadowy existence, but it wasn't. This is the life where you enjoy yourself. And so if you wanted immortality, you got that by your reputation. That was the obsession, first of the Greeks and then of the Romans. Your name would live forever. Well, of course it never does, right? Most people don't know all the presidents of the United States, let alone who the Roman emperor was at any given moment, But you were always trying to attain glory for yourself, that you might have a kind of immortality that the afterlife didn't afford you. Okay? Why would someone give up all their status? This is what as a Roman, you spend your entire life jockeying for position. And again, ways that the modern world, especially for young people, is like the Roman Empire. What are they all trying to get? Followers on Instagram and likes on Facebook. And this becomes the obsession. Am I loved enough from the outside that I don't have to face that kind of gnawing emptiness inside, right? Yeah. So maybe that's what's motivating him. Certainly curiosity, at the very least. But why he's curious, we're not told, but we can speculate. Anyone else? Anything else there? And maybe just to stick close to the text, all that he's been told by Festus, all Agrippa has been told by Festus, is there was this certain guy named Jesus who was dead and whom Paul says is alive. Mm-hmm. And so maybe he just wants to, well, that's an interesting story.
Check that out.
Let's check that story out, yeah. And there are stories like that in the Roman, actually the stories like that in almost every ancient religion. But it's always once upon a time. It's always, what following Rudyard Kipling, for those of us who remember Rudyard Kipling, what we would call a just so story, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why does Pomona come back from the underworld? Well, because she only ate half the fruit, and so we have the cycle of seasons, and Seth, the god of death in Egypt, kills Horus, his father, right? And so you have that constant thing. the moon is chaste, right? The moon loves the sun and keeps getting closer to it. So the chariot keeps getting burned on a monthly basis, and that's why it goes dark, and this kind of stuff. So you have these stories. The story of the God who dies and rises again is common, which is in the 19th century. Who wrote the Golden Bough? I can't remember who wrote that. Anyway, it became a common thing as an Enlightenment move, was to say, well, this is why we can't believe Christianity, because it's just like all those other stories about an ancient God. But that's not, and I'm really trying to emphasize this with the youth right now. That's not how the first Christians experienced it. They didn't experience it as something that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This would be the equivalent of, I went to the prom on Friday with my friend and they were killed in a drunk driving accident on the way home, and then Sunday night I had dinner with them again. It was like that. It's, and that's a very different thing than something that happened in ancient history, and who, frankly, already by this point in history, sophisticated, educated Romans and by extension Greeks didn't believe literally in these stories anymore. You paid honor to the gods in a sense, but the stories were understood to be symbolic and to tell great, we already have this in the Greek philosophers, and I'm sure that it then moved into the Roman Empire under the influence of Alexander the Great. So largely they didn't believe them as literal stories anymore. At least the most educated didn't. But to hear that there was this actual guy who died and rose again, well, at least hear the story, right? That's curious. So I'm going to find out who the author of the Golden Bough was, because that's going to make me crazy that I can't remember it. James George Frazer. So he was the scholar who promoted the idea that Christianity was just another myth alongside other myths, right? But again, that's not, we experience it as happening 2,000 years ago, which for us is like the dawn of time, especially as modern people with all our modern luxuries and technology. But that's not how the first Christians experienced it. They experienced it as an actual, someone they knew well who died and rose again. So this is why he wants to hear this, I'm sure. Anything else in those first couple of verses? First 8 verses, I guess. 7 verses? 8, 9?
How long was this after Jesus was crucified?
I don't know without cross-referencing it with Paul's journeys exactly, because Acts doesn't give us a strict timeline. Then we had this much time, then this much time, then this much time. That's the kind of thing scholars have had to reconstruct by going through Paul's letters and where was he when. Now it does tell us when he's traveling. It just doesn't tell us how long he stayed and how long the travels happened. So that has been the work of generations of scholars to make sure that they've cross-referenced everything as closely as possible. I'm going to have those maps up in here soon. That's the goal of this room. This room is going to be the Bible study room. We're going to have maps and timelines and charts all over the place, and we can look at it whenever we want.
What is the year of Paul's death? We know that? I don't know.
I don't for sure. I want to say around 64, but I'm not positive.
So we're saying 30 years he lives beyond the death beyond the crucifixion.
Yes. Yeah. It's my memory is correct. It's 64. Modern scholars will never date anything too precisely, because they'll be like, oh, well, we could be wrong about this. Well, yeah, we don't have the Roman record telling us when he was executed, but we know pretty close. It's around 64. It's around 64. Which of course puts it just a few years before the destruction of the temple, right? And it also helps us date Luke's gospel. Why don't you date Luke's gospel any earlier than about 70 AD? Well, because he probably didn't write it till after Paul was dead, even though Paul's death is not recounted for us in Acts. So, but it's one of those things, just like the Gospels became, is anyone going to remember this story if we don't write it down? Especially because from about, chapter 16 on, 17 on, he's writing in the first person. He was there for these events. He watched them unfold. Okay. Shall we go on? Okay, verse 23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him, but I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. So this is Pontius Pilate all over again, right? He's done nothing. I'm not sure what all the hubbub is about. It's that superstition that you Jews hang on to, right? So from a practical standpoint, it'd be easier just to get rid of him and have peace. On the other hand, he's a Roman citizen. And if you kill him out of hand, like you can do with any Jewish person in general, because they're not citizens and so they have no rights, then I've got problems, and the emperor could come down on me. So I don't want to lose my head because he lost his. So so I'll just pass things along. And now this is a very sophisticated way of saying, okay, King Agrippa, you deal with him. Your call. All right. And what grabs you in this section here? Anything else grabbing you here?
Well, the idea here of being held without the charges against, what are the charges?
Right, exactly. And he's been held how many years now already without charges that can be substantive. This is actually why we have this kind of thing was common throughout history. This is why we have a right to a speedy trial in our Constitution. Because most places in the world they can arrest you and you can sit in jail for years and not know what the charges are against you. It's common all over the world. It's a good way of intimidating political opponents.
Any of your rivals.
Yep.
Or
You got it. You got it. This is when you hear people screaming about the rule of law right now. That's why it's such an important thing. It's that common law tradition of it applies to all of us, right? The law rules, not the mob. Okay. Anything else grab you?
They said he didn't do anything.
Right. Yeah. It's like I'm not sure what to tell the emperor. Right. So maybe in this conversation, maybe now we'll have something. Maybe there'll be something I can write down. Right?
The only thing he's really guilty of is causing problems.
And it's not him causing problems, as he made clear back in the earlier speeches.
Right.
I obeyed all the
Right.
rules.
I
I
did
did what I was supposed to do.
Right.
It's his message that's causing the problem, which the Romans regard as a superstition.
Right.
Well, if y'all can argue about all this other stuff, why can't he have his argument too? What's the big deal? And by the way, he's a Roman citizen, so doesn't he have more right to speak than the rest of you? I mean, that's got to be their perspective, right? He's the son of a good college professor, and you're a bunch of ignorant peasants. Why wouldn't you listen to him?
They didn't specify the charges.
That's the point. Well, the Jews are bringing charges, but they're not ones that the Romans recognize. What Paul is accused of is not against Roman law. So you can't condemn him. Remember, Jews can't put someone to death. Okay? They don't have a law for that. You can stone somebody if they say Yahweh's name, but I'm sure Paul hasn't done that. But what they can't do is have a formal trial and then an execution, right?
So you get somebody else to do it.
You get someone to do your dirty work for you, yeah. Yep. That's called obeying the letter of the law, but not the spirit. Yeah. Okay. And here's your clarification of that condemnation in the previous paragraph, right? They are asking for his death. It's not just that he get a guilty sentence, but they want him killed, yeah. Okay. Shall we read on?
Yep.
Okay, chapter 26. So Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa. I am going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation and in Jerusalem, is known by all the Jews. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain, as they earnestly worship night and day. And for this hope I am accused by Jews, O king. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and I did so in Jerusalem, and not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So we'll pause before Paul, in his own words, tells us of his conversion.
I'm surprised that Agrippa knows all the Jewish customs. That's unusual, isn't it?
Well, it seems like he's a king, right? So the difference between a king and someone like a tribune leader, or the another word starts with P. Not remembering, it'll come to me. Between those figures, people like the head of the tribune and Felix is he is that title. I'm not remembering right now. They get moved around by the Roman Empire. King is local, doesn't move around. He's attached by his seat, by his throne, to a particular geographic area. So he's been living amongst these people for a long time,
Okay.
and knows their history, their stories, and how to rule them consequently. It's one of the reasons why the Romans were not stupid enough to displace all the local leadership. They simply brought them under their influence. But you needed those local leaders who know the local customs in such a diverse empire to retain order.
Paul begins his speech or his defense very respectfully.
Yes,
Of course.
100%. Yeah. Now this interesting phrase in verse 1, Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense.
Mm-hmm.
That probably is literal, in the sense that he is standing and orating, right? He's using the gestures of public oratory. Paul's trained as a rhetorician. Remember, his dad was a Roman professor, okay, which meant you were trained in rhetoric. In the ancient world, if you're going to be a physician, you trained in rhetoric first and then became a physician. Okay, it was considered absolutely essential, and rhetoric was actually a really high level activity in the sense that they would actually have competitions where you'd have two people. It's funny now because in our day and age, debate club is what all the geeks do when they can't play football. But in the Roman Empire, people paid money to come watch the best speakers compete against each other and see who offered the most convincing argument. So Paul so he's probably taken a stand where he's talking like this and using the gestures, but this is a deliberate use by Luke of a phrase that all of us would know from the Old Testament. When God stretches out his hand, he is about to act with power. Okay? I say to the kids when I'm trying to teach them the rudiments of how to read the Bible, say, pay attention to poetic language. Say, when Isaiah says, and I think it's chapter 51, the Lord has shown his mighty arm in the sight of all the nations, it doesn't mean there's an arm floating over the fields. Okay? It means it's this poetic imagery of God stretching out his power because, that all draws on this imagery, which is most of the Old Testament. God is not portrayed. What's amazing about Jesus is that in Jesus we see God's compassionate face. God is chiefly a warrior through the Old Testament pages. And a warrior, what you want is strength in his arm. That's what he wields his sword or his mace with, or throws his spear with. Okay? So when it speaks about the arm of the Lord, this is God acting in power. Luke is deliberately drawing on this language to make us go, oh, something big's about to happen. And of course, what we're going to see is God acting through Paul. And we've already had Jesus tell Paul he was going to do that when Paul's at prayer in the earlier chapters. So this is a fun thing with Luke. Luke does this all the time. It's the way he tells the story. So Luke will let you know early what's going on. He'll recall a particular event, and so it's like a 1-2 punch. He'll set you up, and then if you're paying attention later on, it's like, oh, that's what he did. That's the thing, you know. He does it in the gospel. So at the end of the temptation story, for instance, we're told that when Jesus, trumps the devil on the third temptation, we're told Satan left him until an opportune time. Fast forward to the Last Supper, then Satan entered into Judas. Oh, he's back. So this is, if you're paying attention, it's like, oh, look at that. I'm pretty sure Luke is the only one who gives us that reference. That the tempter leaves Jesus until the opportune time. I think he's the only one who gives us that in the narrator voice, even though the temptation story is in Mark and Matthew as well. That little nugget is there because it's the way Luke is telling the story. So, now we know. So it's not Judas who is the real problem. It's the one behind Judas. It's, as Deacon Michael likes to call him, the power opposed to our God. Okay. What else? What else grabs you in this opening bit of Paul's speech?
Well, he's kind of reminding the king
Mm-hmm.
of, what I've done from my youth. And,
Yes.
and if the king kind of has,
He's heard the
I mean,
story. Right.
if he's forgotten, oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
kind of,
Yep. Yeah, this is a volleyball technique, right? You don't try to spike from the back row. Someone sets it up on the front row, and then you hit it. So this is what he's doing. He's setting up the part he really wants to get to. And he's also maybe helping Agrippa understand exactly what we were talking about before. Why would he give up all this status, right? Because he's part of the strictest part of the Jewish religion. I mean, understand, the Pharisees did dislike the Sadducees not because they were in charge of the temple, because they were slackers. They were moral slackers, and they didn't like them for that, okay? And they weren't real serious about keeping the law apart from sacrificing some animals, and how hard is that, right? So that's the reason why there's this rivalry between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And now it is, because remember, Agrippa understands the Jewish religion, and that's part of what Paul compliments him for, right? That's really, those opening lines are compliments. He's on trial because of the promise made by God to our fathers. And what promise is he talking about? The resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees believe in and the Sadducees don't. Right? So Paul is casting this. It's, in a way, he's framing the debate between himself and the other Jews for Agrippa, saying it's really about the resurrection of the dead, not just specifically Jesus' resurrection. Now, and this is why Paul will use this language of the first fruits of the dead. Jesus' resurrection proves that the Pharisees were right. He's just the first one. But he's not the last one. He's just the first one. Okay? So, game, set, and match to the Pharisees in that dispute with the Sadducees. But now, with that comes, you have to accept that Jesus is the long-promised Messiah. And so that first line here where he's talking about this promise made by God to our fathers, remember, where does Paul trace, when in his own letters, as we know well from Romans, Paul traces the promise of God about Jesus back to Genesis, back to Abraham, as we're going to get into when we do the book of Genesis in detail. Paul is going to look at that and go, that's God promising the Messiah, right? And now, Jesus is the fulfillment of that. that's the real dispute. Is he's casting it as it's about the resurrection of the dead, but most of them aren't arguing with him about the resurrection of the dead. They're arguing about Jesus in particular. Mm-hmm. So Paul is like a good lawyer here, framing the debate the way he wants Agrippa to see it. Okay. But he's going to get to the specifics about Jesus really quickly, right? So I was motivated to persecute these people who were telling this message. But then something changed my mind, and that's what the next section is about. Anything else in those first 11 verses? Okay. I'll give us some, we're right up against time. Why don't we stop there, and we will pick up at verse 12, 26:12. There's got to be a way I can put a note in here. I've not figured that out. Now, we will be off again next week, unfortunately. I have to help my father-in-law close up his house in South Jersey, so I won't be here on Tuesday or Wednesday next week. But we will pick up again the week after, and as you see, we are very close to done with the book of Acts. I think that it's probably safe to say that by November we will be plunging into Genesis. So the fun thing will be about Genesis will be that, really what we're doing as we do our Bible studies together, this is called exegesis. It's the best, the way I heard exegesis described to me, it means reading out of the text. It's the opposite of eisegesis, which is reading into the text. You don't want to read into the text. You want to read out of the text. But the best way of doing that I ever heard described is it means slowing down the text. Slow it down so you make sure you're catching all those nuances, because they told stories differently than we tell them now. And they knew all the backstory we're missing. So by slowing it down, we start to hear it and see it the way that the original hearers understood the story, right? So in Genesis, that's going to go slower because we're that much further away from that cultural context. So if you've ever wondered where the sons of God come from, and the giants, and the dark angels, we're going to get into all that. That's going to be fun in Genesis. But it is going to slow us down as we tackle especially those early stories.
Because the angels that had fallen made it with people, and that's where the giants came from,
Well,
right?
that's where, and we're going to get into all that.
Yeah.
Why that? Because that language is further from us, and it morphs over time. So when Paul talks about sons of God, referring to those in the church in the New Testament, the phrase "sons of God" means something completely different in Genesis. And if we miss that the way the meaning morphed in those 1700 years between when Genesis was written down and when Paul was writing, we're going to really misunderstand the story. So that's why we're going to have to slow down and redefine some of those terms as they would have been understood by the original hearers. So it's going to be fun.
Quick question.
Yes.
Sunday. Is that Harvest Sunday?
Harvest Home is on this coming Sunday.
Coming Sunday. Okay.
Yeah, so canned goods, dry goods, for all those things for the...
So we could just bring that on. Oh, well, we can't bring it on Sunday.
Yeah, you can bring it
Oh,
Sunday.
we can bring it
Yep.
Sunday?
We're going to pile everything up in front of the altar. There's no communion, so we don't have to worry about
Okay.
flowing up